Good morning. Today we're going to go through carbohydrates. You'll see a series of videos that come up. There is the CK12 reading. Your Google form is for the review questions for that CK12. And then I have a PowerPoint that I'm also putting up that you probably want to pull up as you're watching this video side by side so we can kind of go through it and look. I'm working on, a screen where I can show you the PowerPoint as well. So I'm in the middle of working that out, and hopefully I'll have that up and running by the beginning of next week. So let's go through and let's talk about carbohydrates as we get detailed into it. So we know that it contains the three elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, right? So we have the three main macromolecules that contain those. So just remember that. The general formula as you go through this is on the second slide. You'll see that there are a certain number of carbon. You don't really have to know that, but just know that if you see H2O in there, H2O is water, so just keep that in mind. And then a carbohydrate actually is called hydrate of a carbon. So if you think of hydrate, you could think, what do you do to keep hydrated? Well, you drink lots of water, and if you look at the formula, it has H2O, which is water. So that's kind of how they came up with that name. So they are divided, carbohydrates are divided into three groups, right? Monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. So last video I talked about if you break words down, mono means one, and saccharide would mean sugar. So di means two, and saccharide means sugar. So that would mean two sugars. And then poly is many sugars. So you would have many of these linked basic sugar elements that'll come together like glucose. And we'll see that as the formula kind of moves through and as we move on to the third slide. So monosaccharides and disaccharides are sugars. And what does that mean? That means if you put them in lukewarm water or any water and you kind of swish it around, they're going to dissolve in water. And those are called, that's a solute. And then water is the solvent. So whatever you put into something, okay? Saccharide will often refer to something that's sweet and sugary. And then as you look in there and you kind of look down, the monosaccharides has a very general formula. And you see those three basic elements. Now the number of those elements can change. What is interesting about that is that you will have the formula on there, which is CH2O. And what that looks like, and that's in parentheses, and then you have this odd little letter N that's out there. I don't know if you can actually see that right there. That's actually on your third one. I know that's really bad. Sorry about that. But what that means is that the CH2O is the basic general formula. And then once it gets into parentheses and you have this little N there, that N is replaced by a certain number. So let's say you have a 2 there. And what that means is those two basic sugars formula linked together. So let's say if you have that N is 10, that means that you have 10 basic formulas linked together, and that actually becomes then a polysaccharide. So if you have 2, that's disaccharide. You have 1, monosaccharide. So just think of that. As that N, that number changes, that means that's the number of links that are going on there. So as it explains, mono means one. So if we go on to the next one, it kind of starts to get a little bit more complicated, but under monosaccharides, there are three types of monosaccharides. There's triosis, pentosis, and hexosis. So triosis means there are 3 carbons in there, and that when you start getting into that type is triosis, and that basic sugar means that it is used only in respiration, which is like cellular respiration, so we breathe into our lungs, and then photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is how oxygen is produced in the plants. So that's the reaction that happens within plants to produce oxygen that we then breathe in, and then cellular respiration happens, and then we breathe out carbon dioxide. The next one is pentosis, which has 5 carbon. And what you're going to see here is that this monosaccharide is actually found in nucleic acids, so the DNA and RNA. So this energy in the simple sugar that you're looking at in pentosis, which is a monosaccharide, actually is found out in our DNA. So hexosis is C carbon, which is one of the most common, and this is a respiratory substrate. So that means that that's how that's produced. And actually the 6-ring carbon, which is the hexosis, is actually what we deal with in organic chemistry when we're talking about organic compounds. So organic compounds will have the 6-ring carbon or hexose, and that's pretty much what we concentrate on here in biology. You could see on the next one isomers of glucose, so different structure is what an isomer is, like different design. And you can see there is that little funny wiggly, looks like that, that's a theta glucose and a beta glucose. So you have, sorry, not theta, alpha glucose. And alpha, you don't really have to know about it too much. You could just say that on the end you have an H and then an OH. All it means is that structurally some things are switched around. Same thing, but just different structured. And that's what it looks like. Okay, let's go on to disaccharides. So remember, di is 2, and you have 2 saccharide basic formula put together. So it is the joining of 2 monosaccharides. And then you could have, what the examples are, if you have a glucose plus another glucose linked together, that gives you maltose. A glucose plus a fructose will give you sucrose. And then a glucose and a galactose will give you lactose. And hopefully all of you have heard of lactose at one time. That's actually what you need or what you get out of milk. Sometimes you're lactose intolerant. That's a disaccharide. And so sometimes that can cause stomach issues. So sucrose, you'll know that is a basic glucose and fructose put together. And fructose is what we've talked about in another lecture, which is one of those really bad simple sugars, and having too much can cause diabetes. All right. So there are questions on the PowerPoint. You don't have to turn those in, but that might be really good for you to kind of go through and answer those questions, because what will happen is you may see them on the quiz next week. And so you will have a quiz. I will push out a quiz tomorrow, and you'll have till next week to do that. So make sure that you're going through. What are the 2 main isomers of glucose called? Well, we just went through that. Isomers, your alpha glucose and your beta glucose. What is formed when glucose and fructose are joined together? Sucrose. What is always produced when 2 monosaccharides are joined together? Well, 2 disaccharides. And what elements do carbohydrates consist of? Well, we talked about carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. What is formed when 2 glucose molecules are joined together? Well, you can kind of go back and look at maltose. So you can look at what are the simplest forms of carbohydrates called? Monosaccharides. And what are some examples of that? Glucose, maltose, fructose, those kind of things. A galactose is a simple sugar. So those are the kinds of things you can go through, okay? Disaccharide, it is talking about how do 2 simple sugars, 2 monosaccharides come together and create maltose, right? So you have a sugar, so you have an alpha sugar and then you add another alpha sugar. So how do those actually bond and then become maltose? Well, if you look at your slide 8 under disaccharides, what you'll see is that actually a water molecule, H2O, is taking out. So often when reactions will happen is you will have a water molecule that's released or added. And in this case, condensation, where a water molecule is taken away from the formula, in order for these two monosaccharides to join together to become a disaccharide. And so that is one of the things. Understanding that versus what the formula looks like is more important when asked that. On the next slide, which is slide 9, it is just the opposite. So if you come up and you have a disaccharide, right, you have a maltose, but you actually want to break that down to a simpler form into 2 monosaccharides, well, you have to do just the opposite on that reaction. And that reaction is called a hydrolysis reaction. So when you're going from something bigger to something smaller, you are going to add water, H2O, into the reaction, and that is called hydrolysis. So make sure you kind of go over this or watch this video a couple times to understand that when you are building from something smaller to bigger, you're taking a water molecule out called condensation. And when you're going from something bigger to something smaller in reactions, you're actually going to add an H2O molecule, and that is called hydrolysis. So please know the difference between the 2 types of reactions when we're going from a disaccharide to a monosaccharide, or from monosaccharides and you're adding them together to create a disaccharide in something bigger. So, all right. Go back in reference to monomers and polymers. Remember the monomer, what is that called? Well, polysaccharides are your polymer, right? And for this, the monomer would be a monosaccharide. So you have something very small, poly means big, right? So polysaccharide are the polymers whose subunits are monosaccharides. Remember, monosaccharides join together through condensation reactions, and then they're held together by, not as important because we're not going to really go into different kinds of bonds here. It's a glycosidic bond, but you don't really have to know that. Glyco really just is related to sugar. And then the final molecule maybe have thousands. When we talk about a carbohydrate, and we talk about a macromolecule and something so much bigger, what we're really looking at is that you have thousands and thousands of subunits of monosaccharides linked together through condensation reactions and those glycosylic bonds to create a macromolecule or create a large. So you have monosaccharide units that are linked together, thousands of them. So when you eat food, those are thousands of monosaccharides linked together that go through your digestive tract, get broken down into to the part where by the time that it hits your small intestine and it's being absorbed in liquid form, it's at a monosaccharide form. And that way, it can be easily absorbed, easily transported, and easily used by your cells throughout your entire body. So that's why we're kind of learning these. And once they get to the cell, that's what we're moving into next week, next Monday, when we're going to start talking about that. Understanding that it goes from something big to something small. Okay? All right. Some examples of polysaccharides is starch. That is amylose and amylopectin. So starch is a complex carbohydrate. Maybe some of you have had me for health and wellness, so we've kind of already went through complex carbs. But starch is actually form of glucose in plants. So you will get your starch if you're a plant eater. Glycogen. Glycogen is a stored form of glucose in animals. We are animals. So if you have excess sugar, carbs in your system, and often what will happen is insulin will be released, go pick up that excess sugar and go and take it back to the liver, transform it to store it in long-term glycogen form in your liver. So that's a little tidbit. And then cellulose is a polysaccharide. And this is actually how your plants keep very structured in that rectangular cell because it makes up the cell wall of plants. So the reason that plants have such a structure, they constantly have lots and lots of water moving through them. And so in order to not burst open, or because if it rains for like 3 days like we've had in the last couple days, plants would just burst all over the place if they didn't have this cell wall to make sure it was staying in its structured form. And so that cellulose, which is a complex carb, a polysaccharide, is what it keeps that structured, okay? All right. I am not going to make you really know the amylose and amylopectin, so you can read through that and know, but you really don't have to know that too much, so you can look at it and say, okay, if it seems. Amylose, what you should know about the two different ones is that they have a very different structure. So you'll see that amylose is like a ring-like structure, and then amylopectin is not. It's kind of an attached long chain. Okay. So glycogen, which is probably one of the most important, we know that it's glucose is stored in animal cells. It has a similar structure to amylopectin, so it's kind of those chains, you know, linked off chains. And then and so glycogen actually, because it's that long chain, it actually has like lots and lots of different branches coming off it. And you can take a look at that on slide 19, okay? There are also questions coming down under that, and the questions are, what group of carbohydrates does starch belong to? You can go along and I'll let you do that. And the last one is cellulose. So you will have to know a little bit about cellulose, excuse me. Hundreds of chains are linked together by hydrogen bonds to cause or to create microfibrils. And then the only thing you really need to know that is those microfibrils that are linked together from these cellulose actually help create that cell wall. And then they also give strength to paper, cotton, and sellotape. So just know that cellulose is pretty strong because of the hydrogen bonding that happens to keep these links together to become rigid. Okay, so I hope this really helps. You will have another video coming up also on lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So this is going to be a series of, as we start to increase our homework and increase our understanding. This is a 2-hour bio class, so just remember that. Get lots of information, okay? If you have any questions, please join Zoom at 2 p.m. and we can go through some information. All right? All right, thank you.